You could eat a breakfast that millions of people consider perfectly healthy: granola, a glass of orange juice, whole wheat toast with a little margarine, feel completely fine, have zero knee pain, zero stiffness, nothing, and still be actively dissolving the cartilage inside your knee joints right now. The destruction is happening without any pain signals, without inflammation you can feel, without any warning that anything is wrong at all. And by the time your knees actually hurt, the structural damage has typically been accumulating for 10 to 15 years. Two specific foods are driving this process. Not exotic foods, not foods that anyone warned you about, foods that appear in almost every kitchen in America, foods that nutritional guidelines have either ignored or actively encouraged for decades. Before this video ends, I am going to give you something called the Cartilage Code, a three-step protocol built around the actual biological mechanism of cartilage destruction, not the symptoms. Remember that name, because everything I am about to show you builds toward it. Let me start with a thing that nobody explains properly, because if you do not understand what knee cartilage actually is and how it survives, you will not grasp why these two foods are so specifically dangerous to it. We tend to think of cartilage as padding, like a cushion between two bones. That image is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. Cartilage is a living tissue. It contains cells called chondrocytes, and those cells are responsible for constantly repairing and rebuilding the cartilage matrix around them. Here is the part that changes everything. Cartilage has no blood vessels running through it. None. Zero. It is one of the only tissues in the entire human body that is completely avascular, which means it cannot receive nutrients or remove waste through the bloodstream the way every other organ does. It is also largely without nerve fibers, which is why damage accumulates silently for so long before you feel it. So if cartilage has no blood supply, how does it survive? How do those chondrocytes get fed? The answer is synovial fluid. Your knee joint is enclosed in a membrane called the synovium, and that membrane produces a thick, slippery fluid that fills the joint cavity. That fluid is the only source of nutrition for your cartilage. Oxygen, glucose, growth factors, they all have to diffuse out of the synovial fluid and migrate into the cartilage tissue. The delivery system is mechanical. When you compress the cartilage, by walking, by bending, by bearing weight, you squeeze waste products out. When the pressure releases, fresh synovial fluid gets pulled back in, carrying nutrients with it. Cartilage feeds itself like a sponge, being alternately squeezed and released in water. This is the invisible architecture that makes knee cartilage so uniquely vulnerable to the two foods I am about to name. Because both foods target this system in ways that are quiet, cumulative, and almost completely below the threshold of detection until significant structural damage has already occurred. The biological villain operating in your knee joint right now is not wear and tear from movement. Research has shifted dramatically on this. The villain is chronic low-grade inflammation inside the synovial membrane itself, what researchers now call synovitis, which contaminates the very fluid that your cartilage depends on for survival. Inflamed synovial tissue produces enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases. Think of matrix metalloproteinases as tiny scissors. Their job, under normal circumstances, is to clip away damaged collagen fibers so new ones can be built. But when the synovium is chronically inflamed, those scissors are deployed constantly in excess, dismantling cartilage faster than chondrocytes can rebuild it. That is the mechanism, and both foods accelerate it through different but complementary pathways. We've been told for decades that osteoarthritis, the type of cartilage breakdown most people over 60 experience, is primarily a mechanical problem. Too much weight on the joint, too many miles on the body, just the inevitable result of aging. The Osteoarthritis Research Society International has been publishing data since the early 2000s challenging this framing. A 2012 analysis in the journal Arthritis and Rheumatism found that systemic inflammatory markers, specifically C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, were predictive of knee cartilage loss independent of body weight and mechanical load, meaning two people with identical body weight and identical activity levels can have dramatically different rates of cartilage breakdown based on what is happening in their metabolic environment, the food environment. And that finding has been replicated and expanded across dozens of subsequent studies. Here is where the mainstream health narrative completely failed you. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of osteoarthritis was purely mechanical. Doctors told patients to lose weight, rest the joint, maybe take ibuprofen. Nobody was asking what was in the synovial fluid. Nobody was asking what was feeding the synovial membrane's inflammatory state. The medications prescribed, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, what you know as NSAIDs, work by blocking enzymes called COX-1 and COX-2, which are part of the inflammatory cascade. They reduce pain and inflammation. But here is what your doctor almost certainly never told you. The substrate that COX enzymes act on, the raw material they require to produce inflammatory compounds, is a fatty acid called arachidonic acid. And the primary dietary driver of excess arachidonic acid in your body is the first food on this list: seed oils, specifically the industrial vegetable oils that became the backbone of the American food supply starting in the 1960s and 70s. Corn oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil. These oils are extraordinarily high in a polyunsaturated fat called linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. Your body can convert linoleic acid into arachidonic acid through a series of enzymatic steps. Arachidonic acid is then available as the direct precursor for the inflammatory compounds, prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and thromboxanes that your immune system uses to generate and sustain inflammation. This is not a fringe claim. This is the mechanism that anti-inflammatory medications are specifically designed to interrupt. The critical context is this: your body has always needed some arachidonic acid. A small amount of omega-6 fats in the diet is necessary. The problem is scale. Research published by the National Institutes of Health, including work by Dr. Christopher Ramsden and his team, has documented that the average American currently consumes linoleic acid at a level representing approximately 7 to 8% of total caloric intake. In the early 1900s, before the industrialization of seed oil production, that number was closer to 2 to 3%. Meanwhile, omega-3 fatty acid intake, the anti-inflammatory counterweight to omega-6, has remained relatively flat. The result is a dietary omega-6 to omega-3 ratio that currently sits somewhere between 15 to 1 and 20 to 1 in most Americans. The ratio our ancestors maintained, based on analysis of traditional diets and evolutionary dietary models, was closer to 1 to 1 or 4 to 1 at the outside. What this means for your knee joint is specific and verifiable. When you consume seed oils in quantity, and if you eat any packaged food, any restaurant food, any fast food, most salad dressings, most mayonnaise, most baked goods, you are consuming significant quantities. You are loading your cellular membranes with linoleic acid. Those membranes become the reservoir from which arachidonic acid is mobilized when your immune system needs to mount an inflammatory response. The more linoleic acid in your membranes, the larger the available pool of inflammatory substrate. Your body's inflammatory responses, including the synovial inflammation happening in your knee joints, become disproportionately amplified because the raw material for inflammation is essentially abundant and cheap. Researchers at the University of Bristol published findings showing that individuals with higher dietary omega-6 to omega-3 ratios had measurably greater synovial inflammatory markers compared to individuals with more balanced ratios. The synovium of someone eating a seed oil-heavy diet is not just responding to injury or pathology, it is operating in a state of chronic low-level activation, continuously seeping those matrix metalloproteinase enzymes into the joint space, continuously trimming away at cartilage collagen. Remember the sponge analogy. The cartilage is being squeezed and released, trying to absorb nutrient-rich synovial fluid, but the fluid itself is now carrying chemical signals that instruct the cartilage's own cells to slow their repair activity. Interleukin-1 beta, one of the primary inflammatory cytokines elevated by this omega-6 load, directly suppresses chondrocyte activity. The cells responsible for rebuilding cartilage become less productive precisely when they need to be most active. After the age of 60, this problem is compounded by a biological shift that has nothing to do with diet. Chondrocyte numbers naturally decline with age. The cells that remain become less responsive to growth factor signals. The synovial membrane produces slightly less fluid, and that fluid becomes less rich in hyaluronic acid, which is the molecule responsible for its lubricating and nutrient-carrying properties. In women specifically, the loss of estrogen after menopause removes a previously protective effect. Estrogen receptors exist in both chondrocytes and synovial cells, and estrogen appears to modulate the inflammatory response in the joint. A review published in the journal Osteoarthritis and Cartilage in 2019 found that postmenopausal women show accelerated cartilage thinning compared to both premenopausal women and age-matched men. The baseline biological capacity of the knee to absorb inflammatory insults shrinks after 60, which means the inflammatory load created by seed oil consumption, a load that a 35-year-old body might partially compensate for, operates with far less buffer in a 65-year-old body. The scale of this in the food supply is almost comical if you look at it clearly. Soybean oil alone, as of recent USDA data, accounts for somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% of all edible oil consumed in the United States. It is in the bread, it is in the crackers, it is in the protein bars. It is used to cook the eggs at almost every restaurant you've ever eaten at. It is in the salad dressing you bought because the label said heart healthy. I find this genuinely fascinating in the way that a good con is fascinating, not because of malice exactly, but because of how completely the incentive structure shaped the information environment. The shift from animal fats to seed oils was partly driven by the American Heart Association's recommendation in the 1960s to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated vegetable oils to reduce heart disease risk. That recommendation was made primarily on the basis of cholesterol-lowering effects. The downstream inflammatory consequences for joints, for cellular membranes, for the omega-6 to omega-3 balance, those were not part of the calculation. The institutions were not lying. They were just working with an incomplete model. And 50 years later, we have the data they did not have. My husband, when he was at his worst, before his cardiac event, when he was running on takeout, restaurant lunches, packaged convenience food, ate seed oils in quantities neither of us fully understood at the time. He was not eating chips and fried food all day. He was eating what looked like reasonable food: sandwiches, salads, protein bars, grilled chicken from restaurants, all of it marinated in or cooked in or dressed with soybean or corn oil. When we started actually reading labels during his recovery, under medical supervision, I want to be completely clear about that, he was working with his cardiologist, we found seed oil derivatives in places that defied logic. Tomato sauce, chicken broth, whole grain bread. The penetration is total, and reducing it required a genuine overhaul of where food came from, not a minor adjustment. Results for him were meaningful over time. But everyone's situation is different, and anyone making significant dietary changes with a health history should be working with their physician. Now, the second food, and this one is more surprising to most people because sugar has been discussed so much in the context of weight and diabetes that its direct structural effect on joint cartilage rarely gets mentioned. The mechanism here is completely different from seed oils, and this is important. These two foods do not just both cause inflammation through the same route. They attack cartilage through different pathways simultaneously, which is why their combination is particularly destructive. The first mechanism through which sugar damages knee cartilage is glycation. When glucose and fructose, the two components of table sugar and of high fructose corn syrup, are present in excess in your bloodstream, they bind to proteins in a chemical reaction that does not require any enzymes. It just happens spontaneously when sugar is abundant. The result is called an advanced glycation end product, shortened to AG, which is an appropriately grim acronym. Advanced glycation end products form on proteins throughout the body, but they form with particular abundance on long-lived structural proteins. The proteins that make up cartilage, primarily collagen type 2, are among the longest-lived proteins in the human body. Cartilage collagen can persist for decades, which means there is an enormous surface area of old, slowly turning over protein available for glycation damage to accumulate on. When AGs form on cartilage collagen, they create abnormal crosslinks between adjacent collagen fibers. Imagine the normal cartilage collagen structure as a set of independent coil springs, each one flexible, able to compress and rebound independently. Glycation crosslinks weld those springs together in random configurations. The cartilage becomes stiffer and more brittle. It loses its ability to distribute compressive force evenly across its surface. Localized stress concentrations develop. Those spots begin to crack and fray at the microscopic level. And because chondrocytes also have receptors for advanced glycation end products, called RAGE receptors, again appropriately named, when those receptors are activated, they trigger an inflammatory signaling cascade inside the cell itself. The cartilage cells become contributors to the very inflammation that is destroying them. A 2014 study in the journal Arthritis Research and Therapy found that AG content in knee cartilage correlated directly with severity of cartilage degradation, independent of age. The glycation damage was doing work that went beyond simple biological aging. The second mechanism through which sugar attacks your knee joints is through uric acid. This one is almost never discussed in the context of cartilage health, unless someone has gout, and that is a significant error. Fructose, the sugar found in table sugar, in high fructose corn syrup, in fruit juice, and in many foods marketed as natural or healthy, is metabolized by the liver through a pathway that produces uric acid as a byproduct. Unlike glucose, which is regulated by insulin and distributed to cells throughout the body for fuel, fructose goes almost entirely to the liver and is metabolized there in a way that bypasses the normal feedback mechanisms. One consequence of high fructose intake is a measurable increase in blood uric acid levels, a condition called hyperuricemia. Gout is what happens when uric acid crystals deposit in joints, most famously the big toe, but also knees, and trigger an immune response so severe it causes excruciating acute pain. What most people do not know is that subgout levels of elevated uric acid, levels that would not be diagnosed as gout and would not cause acute attacks, still contribute to chronic joint inflammation. Uric acid at elevated but non-gout levels activates the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is an immune system trigger inside cells that drives the production of interleukin-1 beta, the same inflammatory cytokine that suppresses chondrocyte activity, the same one elevated by excessive omega-6 consumption. Two different dietary pathways, same downstream suppression of cartilage repair. A 2017 cohort study published in Arthritis and Rheumatology found that individuals with hyperuricemia had significantly increased odds of knee osteoarthritis progression even after controlling for gout diagnosis. The damage was happening below the diagnostic threshold. Now consider what daily sugar consumption looks like in the average American diet. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 25 grams of added sugar per day for women and 36 grams for men. The actual average consumption, according to data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, sits at approximately 77 grams per day. That is 3 times the upper recommended limit. A single 12-ounce can of regular soda contains approximately 39 grams of added sugar, predominantly from high fructose corn syrup. A single container of low-fat flavored yogurt, the kind marketed aggressively as healthy, can contain 25 to 30 grams. A standard granola bar has 10 to 15. Breakfast alone, for millions of Americans who believe they are eating reasonably, delivers the full recommended daily maximum before 9 in the morning. What is happening in your knee joint during this chronic sugar excess is a slow architectural disaster. The collagen fibers are being stiffened and cross-linked by AG formation. The chondrocytes are receiving inflammatory signals through their RAGE receptors. Uric acid is activating the NLRP3 inflammasome, producing interleukin-1 beta, which is suppressing the very repair capacity of those chondrocytes. The synovial fluid, remember, the sole nutrition source for cartilage, becomes contaminated with inflammatory cytokines. And the matrix metalloproteinase scissors I mentioned earlier are being kept in a state of chronic deployment. The cartilage is being dismantled faster than it can be rebuilt, and the cells responsible for rebuilding it are being chemically told to slow down. There is a specific number I want you to hold on to here. Cartilage thickness in the medial compartment of the knee, the inner-facing surface that takes the most load, has been shown in MRI-based longitudinal studies to decline at approximately 0.1 to zero point 0.2 millimeters per year in adults with high inflammatory dietary patterns. That sounds small, but the total cartilage in that compartment starts at roughly 2 to 3 millimeters in a healthy 60-year-old. At the high end of inflammatory dietary pattern degradation, you can lose the functional margin of that cartilage in 10 to 15 years. By 70 or 75, that compartment is approaching bone-on-bone contact. 700,000 knee replacement surgeries are performed annually in the United States, according to data from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. The projection for 2030 is over 1 million per year. Those are not just aging joints. Those are joints that were chemically dismantled by decades of a food environment that nobody warned the people inside it about. I want to take a moment to address something that usually comes up here, which is the argument that it is body weight, not diet quality per se, that drives knee destruction. Because the logic seems obvious. Heavier body puts more force on the joint breaks down faster. And weight absolutely matters. Every pound of body weight applies roughly 4 pounds of force on the knee joint during normal walking. Excess weight is a real and significant risk factor, but the relationship between diet and knee damage is not fully mediated by body weight. Several studies, including a 2018 paper in JAMA Rheumatology, found that dietary inflammatory index scores predicted knee cartilage loss independently of BMI. Two people with the same body weight but different dietary inflammatory patterns showed different rates of cartilage degradation. The inflammation in the joint itself, not just the mechanical load, is doing independent work. This matters because it means you cannot simply lose weight and consider the problem solved if you are still flooding your system with seed oils and excess sugar while doing it. There is also a compounding effect between these two foods that makes them more dangerous together than either is alone. High omega-6 consumption impairs the resolution of inflammation. Under normal circumstances, your immune system does not rely solely on producing fewer inflammatory signals to calm down after a response. It also produces specific molecules called resolvins and protectins, which actively signal the end of inflammation and begin tissue repair. These resolving molecules are synthesized from omega-3 fatty acids. When your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is severely skewed toward omega-6, your body has less raw material available to produce resolvins and protectins. Inflammation does not just start more easily, it ends more slowly. Now add the persistent glycation damage and elevated uric acid from chronic sugar consumption, which are continuously re-triggering inflammatory signals, and you have a joint environment where inflammation is being constantly reignited, while the biological fire suppression system is simultaneously under-resourced. The two foods do not add their effects, they multiply them. After 60, the timeline compresses in a way that should genuinely concern you, and I want to be precise about why. The regenerative capacity of cartilage is not zero at any age, but it is dramatically lower in the sixth decade of life and beyond than it was at 30 or 40. This is partly because chondrocyte numbers decline, the cells are simply less numerous. It is also because the remaining chondrocytes become less sensitive to insulin-like growth factor 1, which is the primary anabolic signal that tells them to build new cartilage matrix. And it is because the mitochondria inside chondrocytes, the energy-generating machinery of those cells, become less efficient with age, meaning the cells have less energy available to run the biosynthesis of new collagen and proteoglycans, which are the other structural components of cartilage. A young joint can absorb significant inflammatory insult and compensate. A 65-year-old joint is running with diminished reserves in every relevant system simultaneously. The same dietary pattern that caused modest background damage at 40 causes accelerated visible structural loss at 65. The cruelty of this, and I mean that in a clinical sense, not an emotional one, is that pain is a lagging indicator. The cartilage itself has no nerve fibers, so cartilage loss does not produce pain. Pain in osteoarthritis comes primarily from the subchondral bone underneath the cartilage, from the synovial membrane's inflammation, and from nerve endings in the joint capsule that activate when the joint mechanics become abnormal. By the time significant pain is present, MRI studies typically show cartilage damage that has been developing for years. The people walking into orthopedic offices in pain at 68, 69, 70 often made the dietary decisions that drove this process a decade earlier, when everything felt fine, when there was no signal that anything was wrong. Here is a practical illustration of how seed oils specifically hide in foods you consider healthy. Olive oil gets the headlines. The Mediterranean diet press has been so dominant for 2 decades that olive oil has absorbed an enormous amount of positive association in the public mind. But look at what actually sits next to the olive oil in most kitchen cabinets: a large bottle of canola oil or vegetable oil used for higher heat cooking because olive oil can't handle the heat. Canola oil has a linoleic acid content of approximately 20% by weight. When you use canola oil to roast vegetables, to cook a stir fry, to make pancakes, foods that sound unambiguously healthy, you are loading linoleic acid into those foods. Many people who believe they are eating a relatively clean diet are doing so with seed oil as the silent carrier of nearly every cooked food they eat. Additionally, the oxidation of polyunsaturated fats at cooking temperatures produces secondary compounds, aldehydes, and oxidized lipids that have their own pro-inflammatory properties. This is a newer area of research, and the long-term implications are still being quantified, but the chemistry is not disputed. Seed oils are less stable at high heat than saturated fats, and the breakdown products are biologically active in ways that are not neutral. Sugar hides in a parallel and equally effective way. The food industry has become extraordinarily sophisticated at distributing added sugar across a product's ingredient list in ways that allow each sugar source individually to appear low on the label, while the cumulative sugar content remains high. High fructose corn syrup, cane sugar, dextrose, maltose, brown rice syrup, agave nectar, evaporated cane juice, fruit juice concentrate. These are all added sugars. A single product can contain 4 or 5 of them, each appearing in a quantity that places it lower on the ingredient list, while together they represent a substantial sugar load. The FDA requires total added sugar to be listed in grams on the nutrition facts panel, and that was a meaningful victory for transparency. But it requires you to know that 15 grams of added sugar in a serving is already more than half the recommended daily maximum for women, and that a serving, as defined by the manufacturer, is sometimes a quantity nobody actually consumes. The Arthritis Foundation has noted that individuals with diets high in refined carbohydrates and processed food, categories that overlap substantially with high seed oil and high sugar consumption, show elevated levels of C-reactive protein, which is the most widely used blood marker of systemic inflammation. The Foundation recommends an anti-inflammatory dietary pattern as a component of arthritis management, though the specificity about which foods to eliminate and why tends to get blunted in the communication to patients. The clinical advice often comes out as eat a healthy diet and maintain a healthy weight, which is accurate as far as it goes and completely useless as a practical guide. It does not tell you that the granola you eat for breakfast or the salad dressing on your lunch are loading the specific metabolic pathways that are eating your cartilage. Let me bring this back to the joint itself one more time because I want you to see the full picture of what is happening structurally. The knee joint has 3 compartments. The medial compartment, inner knee, takes the highest load during normal walking and is typically the first site of osteoarthritis damage. The cartilage there starts degrading at the surface where the repetitive contact occurs. Those earliest changes are not visible on standard X-rays. They appear on MRI as subtle signal changes in the cartilage matrix. By the time cartilage thinning appears on an X-ray, which is what most primary care physicians use to assess knee health, researchers estimate that 30 to 40% of the cartilage in that compartment has already been lost. 30 to 40%, gone before the diagnostic tool most commonly used can even see it. If you have had a knee x-ray and your doctor said there's some mild joint space narrowing but nothing serious yet, that x-ray finding represents a process that has been active for a very long time. The synovial membrane, which we identified as the invisible villain at the start of this video, is now understood by rheumatology researchers as not just a bystander to cartilage damage, but an active driver of it. A paper published in Nature Reviews Rheumatology in 2019 described synovitis, synovial inflammation, as present in the majority of osteoarthritis cases, including early-stage cases previously considered purely mechanical in origin. The synovium in an inflamed state does not just produce contaminated fluid. It becomes thickened, more vascular, more metabolically active. It develops pain-sensing nerve fibers that were not previously present. It begins producing substance P, a neuropeptide that amplifies pain signals. The biological process that starts with dietary inflammatory overload ends with a joint that is structurally compromised, biochemically hostile to cartilage repair, and neurologically sensitized to pain. This is the end stage of what begins with oil and sugar. Now I want to give you the Cartilage Code, the three-component protocol I mentioned at the beginning of this video. This is not a supplement stack. It is not a complicated medical intervention. It is 3 specific changes that target the actual mechanisms I have walked you through, not the symptoms. The first component is the oil audit. Within the next 7 days, remove from your kitchen every oil with a linoleic acid content above 15%. That means corn oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil, and generic vegetable oil, which is usually soybean oil with a euphemistic label. Replace them with one of 3 options: extra virgin olive oil for low to medium heat, butter or ghee from grass-fed sources for cooking that requires higher heat, or avocado oil if you specifically need a neutral high-heat option. Grass-fed butter and ghee are considerably higher in conjugated linoleic acid and in vitamin K2 than conventional dairy fat, and their omega-6 content is low. The practical application: read ingredient labels on everything that comes in a package. If soybean oil, corn oil, or any generic vegetable oil appears in the first 5 ingredients, treat it as a significant omega-6 delivery vehicle and make a deliberate choice about whether it stays in your regular rotation. The second component is the fructose threshold. This is not about eliminating all carbohydrates or going low carb. It is specifically about reducing added fructose to a level that keeps blood uric acid in a range that does not persistently activate the NLRP3 inflammasome and does not create a significant Ag-forming glucose surplus. The practical threshold: no more than 25 grams of added sugar per day, with particular attention to eliminating sugar-sweetened beverages entirely. Not reduced, eliminated. A single 12-ounce soda or juice delivers enough fructose to push uric acid levels measurably higher within 90 minutes of consumption. Flavored coffees, sports drinks, sweetened teas, bottled smoothies, these are the primary vehicle for added sugar in the American diet outside of packaged food. Removing liquid sugar is the highest leverage single step. For whole fruit, the fiber matrix slows fructose absorption and reduces the uric acid spike significantly, so moderate whole fruit consumption is not the same problem. 2 to 3 servings per day is not what we are talking about. The problem is extracted, concentrated, liquid fructose delivered without fiber. The third component is joint loading. This one is specifically about cartilage nutrition, not exercise for weight loss or general fitness. Remember that cartilage feeds itself through the squeeze and release mechanism. It needs regular, moderate compression and decompression to pull nutrients out of synovial fluid. The protocol: 30 minutes of low-impact joint loading, 5 days per week, specifically in a movement pattern that cycles compression in the knee. Walking at a moderate pace, around 2 to 3 miles per hour, comfortable enough to hold a conversation, delivers this cycling load effectively. So does stationary cycling with low resistance. So does water walking, which has the added benefit of unloading some of the joint's static compression while still providing the dynamic cycling. What does not count: standing still, sitting still, swimming laps where your feet never load the joint. The cartilage needs the cycle, not just movement in general. 30 minutes, 5 days, Rhythmic loading. This is the mechanical nutrient delivery system for the tissue that has no blood supply of its own. The common mistake that invalidates all three components of the cartilage code is making the oil and sugar changes in isolation while continuing to eat restaurant food, takeout, or packaged convenience food at the same frequency as before. Your home kitchen can be completely clean, good oils, no added sugar, while your overall dietary omega-6 intake and added sugar load remain extremely high because 40 to 50% of American meals are eaten outside the home, where seed oils are the universal cooking medium and added sugar is everywhere. The protocol requires you to apply the same reading the label logic to what you order and where you eat. Grilled chicken at a chain restaurant was almost certainly marinated in or cooked with seed oil. The salad dressing is almost certainly seed oil and sugar. The math does not work if you make careful choices at home and then turn the dial completely the other direction every time you eat out. Restaurant meals can still exist, but they need to be deliberate, not automatic. One more thing, and this is the part one think about most. The fact that this information is not routinely delivered in orthopedists' offices or in the standard advice given to people over 60 who are worried about their knees is not really a conspiracy. It is the predictable output of a system where the incentive to prescribe NSAIDs, recommend knee replacement surgery, and manage pain is vastly stronger than the incentive to explain the dietary architecture of joint inflammation. A knee replacement surgery generates somewhere in the range of $25,000 to $50,000 per procedure, depending on facility and insurance. The information I just gave you costs nothing to implement and targets the root mechanism. These two realities coexist, and neither one requires bad actors to explain. The system is working exactly as its incentives designed it to. Your knee joint is not just wearing out. It is being chemically managed in the wrong direction by a food environment that was not designed with your synovial membrane in mind. The two foods are not exotic, they are everywhere. They are in the things you thought were neutral or fine or even healthy. Seed oils because the guidelines were built on an incomplete model. Sugar because the industry that profits from it has spent decades and enormous sums ensuring that the conversation stays focused on calories rather than on fructose metabolism and joint-specific biochemistry. You have the mechanism now, not a general sense that inflammation is bad. The actual chain, seed oils elevate arachidonic acid, which fuels synovial inflammation, which floods the joint with enzyme scissors that cut apart cartilage while also suppressing the chondrocyte activity needed to rebuild it. Sugar glycates the cartilage collagen directly, making it brittle and cross-linked, while simultaneously producing excess uric acid that activates a separate inflammatory pathway inside the joint, adding to the suppression of chondrocyte repair, both operating simultaneously. Both accelerated by the diminished biological reserves of the post-60 body. Both silent until the structural damage is already significant. The Cartilage Code, oil audit, fructose threshold, joint loading. 3 components, each targeting a different biological mechanism, each specific enough to actually implement. If you are starting the Cartilage Code this week, comment CC below so I can see who is actually doing this. Then subscribe because this channel is where I do the reading so you can skip straight to what actually matters.